Let's face it, you've probably already got an awesome free compressor plugin which came with your DAW. However, you may need some different choices for different situations. That's why in this video, I'm going to be showing you my top 5 free compressor plugins. Hi folks, I'm Mike, and I hope you're well. I'm going to be showing you 5 free compressor plugins in today's video, each with their own little quirks which make them a little bit different to the stock plugins you normally get free with your DAW. Now, although I'm presenting this as a top 5, starting off at number 5 and working my way up to my favorite at number 1, these really could be in any order because their little quirks make them useful in different situations. Now, unusually for a top 5 video, I'm also going to be including a little bit of educational content in this presentation, particularly with regards to saturation, how it's applied and how it sounds. But let's get started with my number 5 pick.
5.
In at number 5, we have Fir Comp. Now, this may not on the face of it seem to offer much more than the stock compressors that you normally get with your DAW, but it does have a couple of tricks up its sleeve, which we'll talk about in a moment. Now, of course, it's got the regular controls that we'd see on a compressor: attack time, release time, threshold, makeup gain, ratio, knee, etc. Now, if you don't really understand what all of the controls do on a compressor, definitely check out my other video called The C Word. I'll link it up here and also in the description down below. In that video, I run through all of the common controls we find on compressors, and I explain it in a way that even you can understand, and that way you can really get ahead and start making use of these useful plugins. Now, back to Fir Comp. What are the features that it offers above your stock compressor? Well, first of all, we've got this SC filter down here. We've got some different frequency based filters which we can go through here. We have a natural one, de-harsh, and a DS one, for example here. The de-esser is a good example of a compressor being used on a narrow frequency range. Those frequencies associated, of course, with sibilants or S type sounds, and that's going to help you to reduce those types of sounds without the need of an actual de-esser plugin. And the great thing is that this Fir Comp plugin uses very little CPU resources. So whether you're using it as a regular compressor or in this case a de-esser, you can have it across many tracks in your project and you're really not going to notice much load on your CPU. That's very welcome, of course, especially if you're using an older computer. Another feature that I'll point out here is the one that kind of gives it its name here. This is the FIR or Fir Look Ahead feature. Fir is a type of an audio filter, so this is doing some gain smoothing here, and this makes it sound sort of a little bit more clean, I guess is a good way to say it. But it does introduce a little bit of latency. Normally when you have this switched off, there's really zero latency with this particular plugin. We do get around about 1.5 milliseconds of latency, but you're not going to notice it with latency compensation. Those are a couple of features on the face of it that we can see are different with this plugin. But what makes it really interesting for me is that this is a very clean, transparent plugin. Not much is being sort of added to the sound at all. It's just changing the volume of things, if you like, which is really what a compressor does. However, if we use very short attack and release times, we do get a little bit of harmonic saturation introduced, some distortion, some pleasant distortion added there, which can add a little bit of character to the sound. Now, I'm going to be talking a little bit later on in the video about things like harmonic saturation, so stick around for that. If you don't really understand what it is, or you can't normally sort of hear it when people give you examples, do stick around for that. But these are the things which make this particular plugin unique in my opinion, and that's why it's at the number 5 spot.
4.
So in at number 4, we have LaLa from Analog Obsession. Now, this is, of course, based upon one of the most famous, if not the most famous of all compressors, the LA2A, which is a specific type of compressor called a leveling amplifier. We'll get to that a little bit later. Now, the original LA2A really only had 2 major controls that we see over here, the peak reduction and the gain controls. These controls that we see on the left over here are unique to Analog Obsession's version of this type of compressor. We'll get to those later, but let's go back to the two main controls that we normally see on the LA2A, those being gain and peak reduction. The easiest way to understand it is this. The peak reduction really acts like a threshold normally does on other compressors. At the moment it's down to 0. I do have a signal going through it, and as I turn it up, when we reach a certain threshold, you'll see that some compression starts happening or some peak reduction starts happening. Now, of course, normally with a compressor, once we have reduced some of the peaks as we're doing here, we can then turn the whole signal up without it clipping, making some of those quieter parts louder while controlling our peaks. So that's what our makeup gain is for, even though it's just labeled gain here. So those are the two major controls. What's special about a leveling amplifier is a lot of the other stuff that we normally deal with on compressors, things like ratios, attack times, release times, etc., are done under the hood, and that's what gives this compressor its kind of special characteristics, if you like. So for example, when we have it in a normal compression mode, it has a compression of 4:1, sort of around about. I paused as I said that, didn't I? And that's because it actually has a sort of a variable compression ratio depending on the source. Then when we use it in limiter mode, we have this switch here for that. When we use it in limiter mode, we get an infinity, if you like, ratio. Now, if you don't understand the difference between a compressor and a limiter, essentially a compressor will reduce the signal once it passes over the threshold, but a limiter will stop the signal passing over that threshold. It will use what we'd call, say, an infinite ratio and reduce it down to nothing. So it has that sort of dual purpose there. Also, I believe things like the attack and release time are dependent on the source material as well, but I think they're around about 10 milliseconds. So the thing about this particular type of compressor is it's sort of really natural and musical sounding, apart from the fact that it also does add some saturation to the sound, and it sort of warms things up, I guess, a little bit. I use that term warm loosely. But it does actually have a particular kind of character about it due to all of the things that we've looked at so far. Analog Obsession have expanded upon that usual character with some of the features that we see over here. So, for example, we've got this high pass filter over here. Now, this is not going to be like an EQ. It's not going to cut out at the low frequencies, but what it's going to do is as you decrease or increase it, it's going to send less of those low frequencies to the compressor circuitry, if you like. So they're not going to affect the compressor so much. So, and that can be a bit of a problem sometimes with low frequencies sort of over affecting a compressor. We also have some sensitivity controls for the mid frequencies here and also for the high frequencies as well. Now, as I mentioned, this does add a little bit of harmonic saturation. What does that mean? So what actually happens with harmonic saturation and what does it sound like? And if you usually listen to these examples and you can't really hear saturation, I guarantee to you by the end of this segment, you'll definitely be able to hear it. And that's largely because the sound that I'm using is very, very simple. In fact, it's a sine wave. I'm generating it at the moment. You can see it here, but I do have it muted. But just so you can hear what it sounds like, it sounds like that. That gets pretty annoying to listen to after a while. So for the moment, we'll just stick with the visuals. Now, I'm going to be adding saturation using this plugin here. This is from IK Multimedia. This is T-Rax Saturator X. Now, this is simply to demonstrate many different types of saturation, and so that you can quickly hear the differences. I'll be flicking between some of them. I'll also be analyzing what's happening with FabFilters Pro Q3, and you can see it there generating that 80 hertz sine wave. So let's start off by looking. Of course, we've got it in its default state at the moment with no saturation being added, and now I'm just going to switch this on with the tape 1 preset being set on. Let's have a look. So right away, we can see these extra bumps here. These are harmonics being added to the tone. So a sine wave is a very, very simple tone with no harmonics in it normally, and now we're adding harmonics to it. Now, by the way, regular sounds or regular instruments have many sort of natural harmonics in them. It's part of what gives them their sound and their character. So a sine wave makes it really simple to both listen to and demonstrate. We'll listen to it in a moment, but you can see those harmonics being added there. And as I switch through the different types of saturation with this particular plugin, you'll see that these harmonics are being added in different ways. There's different spacings between them, and they're being added at different amplitudes. You can see, for example, here the first one is quite high, the second one is low. That's what gives each sort of effect its unique sound. So when you're listening to different plugins with different saturation, they've got their own character, and that's partly because of that. So as I flick through the different ones, as I say, you can see different types of harmonics being added. So how does that sound? Let's switch it off again, and we'll now listen to that tone, and then we'll switch it on again, have a listen for the tape 1 preset. You should hear a difference right away. It's a little bit subtle. It's going to get more obvious to you as we go through some of the presets. Especially that last one there. Okay, so hopefully you can start to hear some of the differences in tone when you're actually adding harmonic saturation. Now, the other thing that can happen to the signal as well is that we actually are changing the shape of the waveform. So for this example, I'm going to go over to my oscilloscope, and there we have our sine wave there. I'll switch on again tape 1. We'll play the tone as well, and then I'm gradually going to increase the gain. Okay, and then have a listen to that. You can see there, if I change the zoom control here, that it's actually changing the shape of the wave there. And different presets have different effects in terms of the shape there, okay? Some of them much more aggressive than others, some of them more gentle. Let me know in the comments down there if that was the first time that you've really heard saturation. We're just using a sine wave. Of course, regular signals are much more complex, and that's why it's sometimes a little bit more difficult for you to hear the saturation which is being added.
3.
So I make no apologies for the fact that there are 2 companies who have dominated this top 5 with more than one compressor each, and they're there simply because I think they are just so good in comparison to the competition. So the second one here from Analog Obsession is called Yala, and it's here because of its quirkiness and because of the fact it really falls into that "oh my god, I can't believe this is free" type category. Let's have a look at its sort of regular features first before we talk about its quirks. So of course we have a mix control here. I shouldn't need to explain that one. We have a release control here going from fast to slow release times. We have a high pass filter, very similar to the one we saw in the last plugin, and then we have this threshold. We'll get back to that in a moment, but the 2 sort of quirky controls are volume and attenuation. This attenuation control is really what you would think of as a volume control. It's more like an output volume, so it's going to control the overall output volume of the plugin. The actual volume plugin, perhaps not that well labeled, works in a really strange way. What this does is this sends more signal to the compressor circuitry, if you like, but it maintains the actual sort of volume or gain. It doesn't change the gain going into the sort of main plugin. The best way to demonstrate this is really by demonstrating it. So I'm going to play this guitar track, and you'll notice that as I turn the volume up, it doesn't get louder, but you will hear a point around about up here where it reaches a certain threshold and the compression does start to kick in. Let's have a listen. So no change in volume as we do this. We go up. We start to see some compression there. So we're driving more signal to the compression circuitry rather than to the main circuitry. That's a really interesting and sort of very organic way to add compression. It's almost like having a threshold control and an auto makeup gain control all sort of in one there. Now, there's something a little bit more quirky about this. They seem to recommend that if you're going to use it in this way, that you leave the threshold control at its default position. That's the way I was doing it there. But you can actually gain more precise control over the threshold by using this feature here. Really quirky control. I should also mention that when you're using this control over here, it does add a reasonable amount of saturation as well, adding that little bit more fullness and color to the signal. By the way, if you are finding this video useful, go ahead and hit the like button for me. Do it right away so that you don't forget. And if you do like this kind of content, make sure you subscribe and ring the bell on YouTube so that you're notified about my other videos. Let's get back to this video.
2,
What you probably don't have amongst your stock plugins with your DAW is a compressor which is tailor-made for mastering, and that's why I've got Kotelnikov here in at number 2. This is a mastering compressor which I think could also be used on individual tracks, but it really is tailor-made for this purpose. Now, on the face of it, of course, we've got many controls that we normally see on a compressor. We've got attack over here, we've got ratio up here, we've got a knee control here, and of course we've got a threshold. And as you increase this threshold and we start to see some compression happening, it does introduce some harmonic saturation as well. So there's a little bit of a coloring of the sound happening, albeit quite subtle. Where things get a little bit different with this compressor is with the release times. We've got 2 release controls here. One is based upon the peak value of the signal, so this is the release peak control, and then the other one is based upon the average value of the signal, the RMS. Now, if we take this control up here, the peak crest control, and pull it all the way over to the left, we'll see here that we're only using the release control, which is based upon the peak of the signal. If we push this peak crest control all the way over to the right, then we'll see that we're only using the release control based upon the RMS. And of course, we can blend those two things together using this peak crest control. What I find with this is it makes for some really subtle release times, making the compressor quite transparent. And I think normally in mastering, in most cases, we don't really want to hear that there's compression happening. So I find this a very useful plugin from that point of view. Now, over on the left hand side, we have a couple of controls that are worth explaining. First of all, we have a high pass filter, or a low frequency relax as they call it here, and we've got some ability to control what frequency that happens at, and also the slope there as well. Down at the bottom, we have this stereo sensitivity control. Now, if we're working with a stereo signal, of course the left and the right channels can be quite different at times. So with this control, we're sort of changing how sensitive the compressor is to the difference between those two signals. Is it working solely on the combined signal, or is it reacting to individual channels as well, in terms of left and right? So overall, this is one of my favorite plugins at all, never mind compressors or whatever type of plugin. If you haven't got this in your library, I definitely recommend get it, download it, give it a try out, using it for some mastering on your tracks, and you should be able to use it in a very subtle way and get some subtle compression on your material. So before we look at my number 1 pick, I've just got a couple of honorable mentions that I'd like to talk about here. These are plugins which didn't quite make it into the top 5, but they're definitely worth you considering downloading and having in your collection. The first of these is called Slam Pup. There's only 2 major controls on this compressor, those being Bark, which controls really tube saturation and distortion, and also Bite, which is the threshold control. I find that Bark is fairly aggressive fairly quickly. As you go from the sort of 0 setting down here to around about 9 o'clock, it gets very aggressive. And that's why I feel like this plugin is best used in a parallel compression situation. We've got it on a separate bus. You're going to heavily compress your signal and then just slightly blend that signal in with your original signal. Very handy plugin to have in your collection. The second plugin I'd like to quickly mention is Klanghelm's DC1A. One of my favorite companies, Klanghelm. I just think they make some of the most beautiful looking plugins. This one's really simple to control. You don't have threshold. Instead, you use input to add more signal, and then you'll get more gain reduction there as you move it up. You can see that happening on the metering up there, and then you can just adjust your output volume accordingly. We have a few controls here. Some of my favorites would be Deep, which is a high pass filter like we've seen on some of the other controls, with just a one button press there. Relax, which changes this from peak released, I believe, to having it based on RMS, and then dual mono here, which compresses either the signal as a mono signal, so overall, or does compress the left and the right signals separately. Just some of the features in that plugin, probably worth you downloading and giving it a go.
1.
So for a plugin which occupies my number one spot, Molotok doesn't take much explaining really. It's got all of the controls you'd expect to see on a compressor. Things like the threshold control over here, attack, release, and ratio. Core controls that we have with most compressors. So why would you use it over your stock plugin? Well, your stock plugin compressor is most likely very, very useful, but very transparent. What if you want to add a little bit of character quite quickly? This is where Molotok will come in. Again, you can use it. It's very useful. You could use it in lots and lots of situations, just like your stock compressor, but it does add a little bit of color. And we control that color with this control down here, the alpha, beta, sigma control, I think it is. All the way over here with alpha, I feel that's a lot more saturated and less so as we go around. You'll have to download it and have a listen for yourself to see what you think about that in different situations. But the reason this occupies the number one spot is really because it's just so kind of useful. There's nothing sort of too specific or specialized about it apart from the colorization, so you could use it in an awful lot of places. In terms of some other specific features, I do like the fact that they've got this ability when you click on the metering here to change the resolution. It's not doing it for me now. There we go, changing it now. So you can change that to different resolutions. That could be quite handy because sometimes we're dealing with quite a small amount of gain reduction, and that can be handy to sort of zoom in. And also I like the fact that they've included things like this A/B control here, so we can compare two different settings easily with each other. There's a few other controls, things like the stereo to mono control here, couple of different modes there in terms of using the compressor, and also this precise control over here, which really is helpful if you've got sort of low system resources and you need to go into a more economical mode, or you're not bothered about that and you want to have very precise detailed control. Then you've got some options there. But overall, the reason this is number one is because it's very, very useful in many, many situations, and it is often the case that you want to add a little bit of character to your signal. So what do you think? Did I miss your favorite free compressor plugin? If so, let me know in the comments down below, and also let me know which is your favorite from this top 5. Check the links in the description to download each plugin, and while you're there, check out my link for patreon.com, where for as little as $1 per month you can help me help you by making more videos like this. And I'll see you in the next video.